But remember, as we went over with the thesis statement before, it needs to be a short, clear, and strong statement. Since we're beyond the old standby of the 5-paragraph essay, you don't need to list your topics in your thesis, only your central argument that ties your topics together. Remember, you're trying to convince your reader that you are right and that they should listen to you. Also remember, what you're trying to prove is some argument with your thesis. If it's a simple research paper, you're probably just making an argument about a factual basis or giving an extended definition. These two types of claims are related and talk about things as they are, what is true about them, and maybe dispelling a few commonly held inaccuracies about them. However, there are other kinds of claims. Claims of value argue that something is worthwhile, that this one movie is better than all others, that work of art is beautiful. You will seldom have a whole paper based on a claim of value, but claims of value may come in as support for other more complex arguments. Then there are claims of cause. This event caused that because these arguments deal with what the true mechanism of change causes certain events to be, in terms of human psychology, scientific laws and effects, or historical movements. And often, based on arguments of cause, arguments of policy argue that since doing these sort of things in the past have caused something good or bad, we should act in the following sort of manner. As you write the pieces of your argument, keep in mind what kind of argument you're making, and does this or that fact serve a purpose to prove my argument? Now, sometimes when you're writing a thesis, you will need to add qualifying words or phrases such as almost, likely, most, to some extent, frequently, may, often, typically, hardly, maybe, probably, usually, might, sometimes, very, in most cases, to cover the fact that you can't absolutely prove your thesis is true in all cases. Qualifiers do the wonderful job of giving you wiggle room and allowing you to appear thoughtful and responsible, because they show you don't think only in terms of absolute black and white. Now that you know what you're arguing, you need to set out how you're going to prove this. Again, this consists of 3 parts in your outline. 1, background definitions. 2, the primary argument. And 3, deal with objections if needed. Background information is needed to center an argument. If you're making an argument about the book Wuthering Heights for an audience that has never read the book, you may need to give a summary of the plot and an outline of the characters. But if you're making an argument for a teacher or your class which is familiar with the book, then you need only quickly remind them of the points that are important. 2 general rules you can usually work from is 1, never let background information exceed 15% of your paper, unless it's a research paper, which is primarily background. And 2, in general, you should assume your reader is 2 to 3 grades lower than you. That is, if you're a senior writing about Congress for government, assume your reader is a freshman and give enough background so that a freshman could understand what you're talking about. A word on definitions. If your argument relies on a specific word or term, or a series of such words and terms, you may want to take the time to make sure your reader understands what you mean by that term. Sometimes words have different meanings in different contexts, and you want to make very clear what you mean by this or that word or term. At this point in your outline, you're going to come to your actual argument. You should probably come up with 3 to 4 smaller arguments that, when put together, prove that your central thesis is correct. This is where you provide a lot of evidence and facts for your thesis being correct and couple it with explanation and argumentation. Again, we'll get into the specifics of how to make a strong argument later and how to deal with objections. But for now, you should know the order of laying down your thoughts. Sometimes your arguments are going to be rather complex, and your 3 to 4 main points will need to be broken down into smaller arguments themselves. If this is the case, be sure to always come back to your central thesis and don't let your reader forget what it is and how these separate arguments lead back to that thesis. Finally, you will need to consider what problems others might see with your argument. If you can foresee objections and can counter them, it only makes your argument that much stronger. So you should make a list of all the possible logical objections to your argument, if there are any. Then you need to break them into two piles. The first is strong objections. You should make concessions and say, yes, that this is true in this other case, but it's not really relevant here because I never argued that. This is why you add the qualifiers to your thesis, because the properly placed qualifier can undo a good objection. If you don't use qualifiers that say you may not be correct in all situations, and if you don't make concessions, then your reader will assume that your argument is simply wrong, even though it may be true 9% of the time, and that strong objection only applies to their 10%. Meanwhile, your second pile of the weaker objections, you need to take them all head on and destroy their faulty logic. I recommend taking no prisoners. Finally, in your conclusion, you restate your thesis and sum up your argument very quickly. Remind your reader of what this whole essay has been about and why you are right.